All right, let's take a little bit closer look at return on investments, which in this course I'm going to do a simple, again, plain vanilla simple approach of looking at return on assets. So I'm going to look at net operating income divided by amount of assets that have been invested in. Managers have the opportunity to sort of look for money within the corporate finance market, within the organization, and invest in assets with the expectation of earning a return. Now, some of you might be in, or you might know of people who are in a situation like maybe a common thing that I've heard students talk about is if they're in the IT department and their job is to make an investment in new assets, not for the purpose of generating new revenue, but for generating cost savings. So if I invest in robotic process automation or something like that, I can get a lot of cost savings for the investment that I've made. And so in that case, we have to think about NOI a little bit more broadly. We have to think about the benefit obtained by making some kind of an investment. However we think about it, whether revenue is included or whether just cost savings are included, or maybe there's just revenue and no cost savings, this is really the thing we need to figure out. We've made an investment and we're going to have some kind of a recurring periodic benefit, an annual benefit of cost savings or additional profit or revenue, and we have to compare this. And again, our shareholders, our capital suppliers, need to earn a particular percentage return because they've got the opportunity to invest elsewhere. And so because our shareholders need to cover their opportunity cost of investing somewhere else, we need to make sure that we earn a high enough return that they will keep their investment in our business and not either fire us or pull their investment out or sell the stock and bring the stock price down and make their remaining shareholders unhappy, and then we get fired. So however the pain would come, the pain will come of shareholders moving their capital somewhere else if they don't see appropriate benefit. Again, I'm not saying this to pick on shareholders or to call them greedy capitalist pigs or whatever, but we should not expect people to continually invest in our risky venture for a lower return if they can invest in an equally risky venture and get a higher return. That's just expecting people to be foolish. So, how does this work? Let's take a look at this basic approach of return on investments. A few things to say about it. One thing we need to say about it is you may often see this return on assets sort of broken down into some component parts. So you can look at the DuPont formulas or something you might see somewhere where the old DuPont chemical company started this 100 some years ago. Look at sort of an algebraic breakdown of this. So we can look at our profit margin. Are our sales profitable? And then compare that to or multiply that by our asset turnover. And these should be some ratios you've seen already a few times. And so if you do the math, of course, our sales will cancel, and all that you have left is net operating income over assets. And so this is one way to look at, if I want to look at how to improve my net operating income, well, which of these things do I need to improve? Am I using my assets well and getting plenty of sales, and my sales just aren't profitable? Well, then I have to find out a way to improve my profitability, increase prices, decrease operating costs, that kind of thing. Another possibility, if my net operating, or if my return on investment is too low, another possibility is that my sales are perfectly profitable, I just don't have enough of them. So I've made too much of an investment in assets, I'm not getting enough benefit from sales from that investment in assets. So in that case, I'd either need to divest of some assets, sell off some unproductive assets, or find ways to make those assets more productive. Maybe there's more investment in people or better marketing or whatever it is to make the sales more profitable. So this is one way to think about how to improve my ROI. Another thing that sometimes people do with NOI is they will take, with return on investment, is they'll take the return on investment, the return on assets, and they'll multiply it by assets over equity, which is a measure of financial leverage. And again, assets would cancel, and all we're left with is NOI over equity, and that is return on equity. And this is a way of saying how much are our shareholders benefiting from the NOI, taking into account the fact that assets equal liability plus equity, and if we have a lot of debt, we can get a lot of assets. A little bit of equity can be controlling a lot of assets, and if those assets are very productive, then we can have a really, really high return on equity. So that's leverage. That's using the lever of debt to increase the power of our equity to control lots of assets. Of course, there's also a risk. Lots of debt means you've got to pay back lots of debt. And so what you don't want to do is get in a situation where you increase leverage without considering the risk. But just in terms of an overall financial sort of point of view, it's a way to sort of think about how the various components of corporate performance can be measured. All right, so that's a couple sort of ways to think about this fraction from a fraction standpoint. Now, what are some good things and bad things about return on investment? As I said before, if you've got return on investment, you are surely doing your best, or doing at least something, to make sure that managers are held accountable for how much investment they make in assets. So that's good. And again, going back to the unknown example, you want to make sure you don't ever fail to hold people accountable for that. But there are a few problems with this. One thing you want to keep in mind is in multiple levels of an organization, there are going to be different points of view. I said earlier in my overview video that top managers are investment center managers, but there could also be investment center managers beneath them, geographically or product line or different companies. Again, we talk, if you think about Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett as the CEO, and he has historically pretty famously taken a very hands-off approach. So Berkshire Hathaway invests in a whole bunch of companies, buys them, and lets the company management basically run them how they want to. Part of what he buys is the quality of top management. So in that case, not only is Warren Buffett and Charlie, whatever his partner Charlie, whatever his name is, I forget his name. They're surely investment center managers. They're deciding what companies Berkshire Hathaway invests in. At the same time, though, their investment center managers are beneath them, and what they will do is they'll probably go up to Berkshire Hathaway and ask for more capital if they want to invest in new things. If the railway company wants to invest in new railway lines, if Coca-Cola wants to invest in new production lines, or whatever it might be, they're going to go up the corporate food chain and ask for capital. Now, anytime you've got people here and people here, you've got the potential for conflict of interest. Now, how does this work? Well, we need to think about how this performance measure tends to get used. If you are an investment center manager, your job is to maximize return on investment. Well, what if you are the top performing manager? So let's just say that we've got the simple division here, or the simple company we've drawn here. Forget that it's Berkshire Hathaway. We've got a company up here that's got two different investment centers, and we've got a CEO that's measuring the whole thing. Let's say this investment center manager, this is you, and you're making 28%. You're doing a great job. And then this other investment center manager is me, and I'm making 2%. I'm doing a lousy job. You're clearly doing better than I am. Well, the top management might be looking at this and saying, well, it's great that you're making 28%. It's lousy that I'm making 2%. But top management might have an ROI target. That ROI target is generally going to be tied to something called the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital. I imagine you've heard about this from your finance classes. This is basically for every dollar the company gets, what is the percent return it's got to make in order to pay back the cost of getting that dollar. We talked earlier about the return to both debt needs to pay off its interest, and equity needs to pay off its dividends and capital gains. So if I'm a CEO, for every dollar that's invested in my business, I've got to make a certain weighted average cost of capital. I've got to make enough cash to pay off interest and dividends and enough profit for capital gains. So as a top manager, I've got a target, and as a CEO, I've got a target to earn. So let's just say, for example, and this is just for discussion purposes, that I think my weighted average cost of capital is about 15%. So basically, if an outside party, either a lender or a shareholder, invests money in my business, I assume I've got to make a 15% return on it to pay off that capital cost. Anything above that is profit that the company gets to keep. Anything below that means I'm failing to meet my shareholders or my lenders' requirements for their capital. So what if I've got this 15% external target? My job as your job as an investment center manager is going to be make sure you earn enough that you can cover the 15%. Well, you're already well above that. So here's 15%. Here's you cruising along at 28%, and here's me limping along at 2%. What happens if a new project comes along? What happens if a project comes along that you have the opportunity to invest in, and so do I? The company as a whole has an opportunity to invest in a new project. And let's say this new project, we do the analysis and we think this new project is going to earn new project number one, we think is going to earn a 20% return. All right, so a new project comes along and it's going to earn about 20%. Now let's assume that we can predict it with perfection, take away any risk that, or ignore for the moment any risk that our 20% projection is incorrect. Let's assume it's a pretty solid projection of 20%. Does top management want to borrow money at 15% and invest it at 20%? Absolutely they do. Top management wants this project. Because 20% is greater than 15%. Right? If I can get money at 15, invest at 20, I'm going to make a 5% profit on every dollar that I invest. That's a good thing. But you're sitting here at 28%. Do you want to invest? Do you want to take capital and invest it and earn a 20% return? Turns out you're not going to want to do that. Why? Well, because 20% is lower. 28% manager won't invest in project one because 20% is lower than 28%. And the way math works, if you're averaging two fractions, you get something in between, or if you're averaging to anything, you get something in between. So if you take your 28% business and you add a 20% project to it, your project, your overall ROI is going to come down from 28% to something less than 28%. That's not interesting to you. Now, I, as the lousy manager, will certainly want to invest in a 20% project, and top management will want me to. So in that case, you might turn down the project, I might invest in it, but here's the other thing. Maybe you could earn 20% on it, and I can't because you're a better manager than I am. So maybe if I invest in it, it's only going to earn 10%. So, if the project needs an appropriate manager, to get the work done. So it's possible that only you could make a good profit on the project. So there's a conflict of interest here. Anything that is above the required rate of return, but below a particular manager's current rate of return, the manager is not going to want to invest in, because it's not going to help that manager achieve the goal of maximizing ROI. There's another conflict. Let's say new project 2 comes along, and new project 2 makes a 10% return. Now, top management surely does not want to borrow money at 15% and earn 10%. That sounds like a bad idea. It is a bad idea. Nobody wants that to happen. So top management doesn't want it to happen. You don't want it to happen. You're certainly not going to take a 28% company and add a 10% project to it. You're certainly going to reduce your ROI. But what about me? About me, the lousy manager who's currently sitting on a 2% return? Do I want to invest in a 10% project? Well, yeah, I actually do. This is going to bring my ROI up. It's going to increase my ROI. Even though top management doesn't want me to, I'm going to want to. That 10% is looking a lot better than my 2%, so I'm going to want to invest in that. So we have another conflict here. The conflict is that bad managers will want to invest in bad but less bad than they're currently doing projects, just like good managers will want to invest in good but not good enough projects. Sorry, good managers will not want to invest in good but not good enough projects. So ROI has this problem of creating conflicts of interest where managers who have the authority to decide on what they invest in are not going to want to make investments that are they're not their own best interest. They're not going to want to make the same decisions that top management will. So while the measurement of ROI does include both income and assets, and so it is holding managers accountable for the investments they make, at the same time, because you've got different levels of evaluation in the organization with different standards, your top managers are going to be obviously making more than your required return. There's going to be conflict with those managers. So that's one thing that is a constant problem with ROI and is very, very difficult to undo. We'll talk a little bit later in one of the examples about this idea called residual income. That's a way to address the conflict of interest problem. So that's one problem, is the conflict of interest problem. Another problem is the asset measurement problem. So I talk about net operating income over assets. Well, how do we measure assets? How do we put a dollar value on assets? Do we measure them by their historical cost? Do we measure them by their net book value, which is cost minus accumulated depreciation? Do we measure them by their replacement value? Do we measure them by their liquidation value? How do we measure our assets? There's lots of different concepts, and all of these are valuable for different things, and they happen to have different impacts on how managers behave. So why does this matter? So let's just say we've got a set of assets that are kind of old and fully depreciated. So I've got an NOI over assets, and let's just say the cost of the assets is $100 million, but the net book value is only $5 million because most of my assets are fully depreciated. Well, what happens if I replace these assets with new assets? What happens if I buy new assets? Well, I'm going to take the old assets off the books, and I'm going to buy new. All my accumulated depreciation goes away, and my cost is going to go back up to, or my book value is now going to go up to what the new cost is. Right, because my assets are new, they're not fully depreciated anymore, so my cost is going to go up to $100 million to replace my new assets. What's going to happen to my ROI? Well, my net income will probably go up a little bit with new assets. New assets are probably more productive than the old ones, but my assets are going to go up a ton. And so my ROI is going to decline. Am I going to be interested in doing this? Probably not. So if we use net book value as the measurement of assets, what's going to happen is managers are going to be really reluctant to replace their assets, because if they replace their assets, their ROI is going to decline. One of my colleagues here at Xavier used to work at a large industrial manufacturer, and he worked there in the 80s, I think, and a lot of their assets were from before World War II. And the assets were very old and not terribly productive and fully depreciated. And he said one of the primary reasons the managers in the plants never wanted to replace the assets was this very reason, that their net book value was very low, so the return on investment looked high. In fact, the calculation was high. But at the same time, the assets were not productive and they should have been replaced, but managers didn't want to take the hit to their return on investment from the denominator of their fraction going up. So that's managers acting in a selfish way, probably harming the company's overall competitiveness with their strategy. So this is a real thing that affects real businesses. But here's the thing. If you don't demotivate replacement of assets, if you use a denominator that never discourages investment, let's just say you always record your assets at the historical cost and you never depreciate them, or never include the depreciation in the denominator, well, what's going to happen then is if I replace new assets every year, I don't really have a big hit to my denominator, and I could be too overly tempted to replace my new assets, and so I might be investing in new assets hoping for an increase in NOI, but maybe it's possible to overinvest. It's possible to replace your assets too frequently. So there's really no neutral, there's no unbiased option here. Any choice you make is going to have consequences. You kind of have to figure out what your managers are most likely to do wrong and bias them toward making the right decision. So another possibility we could use is the replacement value. So every year, your assets would be valued at how much it would cost to replace them. So whether you buy new assets or not, you're held accountable, your measurement holds you accountable for the cost of new assets. That would really, really encourage you to buy new assets to get any efficiency or productivity value out of those assets, because you're going to be held accountable for the new assets regardless. That would really come into play, I would think, when managers would be really, really reluctant to invest. Maybe for whatever reason, they're very risk averse. Maybe the company is in a situation where it's really trying to shift its strategy and needs new assets to complement a new strategy. And the managers who are making decisions are for whatever reason, very, very unlikely to invest. Maybe they're nearing retirement, and they want to make sure they protect their last few years of high earnings, for Social Security purposes or retirement purposes or whatever. For whatever reason, you've got managers who are really, really reluctant to invest, and the company's strategy requires it. So one thing you could do, I wouldn't say recommend it, one thing you could do is make sure that every year you sort of reprice the assets at what it would cost to replace them. And then managers would be more likely to invest. Another thing you could use is liquidation value. How much could I sell the assets for on a secondhand used equipment market, that kind of thing. And this measures the opportunity cost. In other words, every year that we continue to keep the cash we have invested in these assets for the operating purposes that we're using them for, we miss the opportunity to sell those assets on a secondary market, take the cash and use it for something else. So this is sort of the most relevant current value of my decision to use these assets for earning net operating income is costing me the opportunity to sell them for however much. So even if they originally cost me $100,000, maybe I could only sell them for, or $100 million, maybe I can only sell them for $25 million today because they're used and whatever. And so that would give me a measure of how much is my decision to use them for operating assets instead of selling them. How much is that costing me? And that cost would be compared to the net operating income that is provided. So there's reasons for all of these different measurement concepts. They're all fine. They're all good. You just need to recognize what effect they're going to have on managers' incentives and interest in investing in new assets.